The morning started like any other Tuesday for Margaret Henderson. She was 70 years old, living alone in the same house she'd shared with her husband for 42 years. The house sat on a quiet street in Atlanta, with tall oak trees lining the sidewalk and neighbors who still waved from their porches. It was the kind of neighborhood where everyone knew everyone. At least they used to doubt Margaret had just finished her coffee when she heard it. A loud crack, and a crash that made her jump from her kitchen chair. Her heart pounded as she rushed to the back door, already knowing something was terribly wrong. When she looked out into her backyard, her stomach dropped. The entire fence along the back of her property had collapsed. Not just leaning or damaged, but completely fallen over. Wooden panels lay scattered across her lawn like dominoes that had been knocked down by an angry child. The storm from the night before had been fierce, with winds that rattled her windows until past midnight. But she never imagined it would do this kind of damage. Margaret stepped outside in her slippers, walking carefully through the wet grass. The fence had been old, she knew that. Her husband Thomas had built it himself 20 years ago, back when his hands were steady and his back was strong. Since he'd passed 5 years ago, Margaret had done her best to maintain the house, but there was always something. A leaky faucet, a broken gutter. Now this. She stood there for a long moment, just staring at the mess. The fence bordered her property and her neighbor's yard, and now there was nothing separating the two spaces. She could see straight through to the street behind her house. Anyone could walk right into her backyard. The thought made her feel exposed and vulnerable. Margaret went back inside and called 3 different handyman services. The first one quoted her $1,500. The second said $2,000 because they'd have to remove all the old wood first. The third didn't even call her back. She sat at her kitchen table with the phone in her hand, fighting back tears. Her pension covered her bills and groceries, but barely. She had some savings, but that was supposed to be for emergencies, for medical bills, or if the car broke down. Not for a fence. For the next 2 days, Margaret tried to figure out what to do. She called a few more people, left messages that went unreturned. One contractor came out to look at it, sucked his teeth, and said he was too busy for the next 3 months. She even considered asking her son Daniel for money, but quickly pushed that thought away. Daniel had his own family to support, 3 kids in college, and she refused to be a burden. On the third day, Margaret was sitting on her front porch, just needing some air, when a pickup truck slowed down in front of her house. She watched as it pulled to the curb, and a man stepped out. He was tall, maybe in his mid-40s, wearing work boots and a faded blue t-shirt. He had kind eyes and a cautious smile. "Excuse me, ma'am," he called out, walking up her driveway. "I hope you don't mind me stopping. I was driving by yesterday and noticed your fence in the back looked damaged. I'm a contractor, and I just wanted to check if you needed any help." Margaret stood up slowly, one hand on the porch railing. She'd lived long enough to be careful about strangers, but something about this man seemed genuine. Maybe it was the respectful distance he kept, or the way he waited for her permission before coming any closer. "That's very kind of you," she said. "The storm knocked it down 3 days ago. I've been trying to find someone to fix it, but everyone wants so much money." The man nodded. "I understand. Would you mind if I took a look at it? No charge for an estimate. My name's DeMarco Williams, by the way." Margaret hesitated for just a moment, then decided, "I'm Margaret Henderson. Come on around back." They walked together through the side gate, and DeMarco spent several minutes examining the fallen fence. He crouched down, tested some of the wood, pulled at a post still standing in the ground. Margaret watched him work, noticing how thorough he was, how he didn't rush. Finally, he stood up and brushed off his hands. "Well, Mrs. Henderson, I've got good news and bad news. The bad news is this fence is done. The wood's rotted through in places, and those posts aren't going to hold anything up anymore. But the good news is, I can do this job for you at a price that won't break the bank." "How much?" Margaret asked, almost afraid to hear the answer. DeMarco thought for a moment. "For materials and labor, I could do it for $600. I know that's still a lot, but it's honest work, and I'll make sure it's done right." Margaret felt her eyes well up. It was still more than she wanted to spend, but it was less than half what everyone else had quoted. "Why would you do it for so little?" she asked. The other people wanted 2 or 3 times that much. DeMarco smiled, a warm, genuine smile that reached his eyes. "Because I remember when my grandmother needed help and couldn't afford it. People took advantage of her, charged her way too much because they thought she didn't know better. I promised myself I'd never do that to someone else. Plus, I've got the time right now, and honestly, I could use the work." Something in his voice told Margaret he was telling the truth. There was no sales pitch, no pressure. Just honesty. "When could you start?" she asked. "I could start tomorrow if you'd like. It'll take me about 2, maybe 3 weeks working afternoons. I've got another job in the mornings, but I'm free after 1 o'clock." Margaret nodded slowly. "All right then. Let's do it." They shook hands and DeMarco wrote down his phone number on a piece of paper from his truck. As he drove away, Margaret stood in her backyard, looking at the broken fence with different eyes. Maybe it wasn't such a disaster after all. Maybe, somehow, this was going to work out. That night, she slept better than she had in days. She didn't know it yet, but that broken fence was about to change her life in ways she could never have imagined. Sometimes the worst things that happen to us open doors we didn't even know were there. Sometimes a storm doesn't just break things down. Sometimes it clears the way for something new to begin. The next afternoon, right at 1:15, DeMarco's truck pulled up in front of her house. He got out with tools and a measuring tape, ready to work. Margaret had made extra iced tea, something she hadn't done for anyone in a very long time. As she poured him a glass and brought it out to the backyard, she found herself smiling. The fence was broken, but somehow, standing there in her backyard with the sun shining down, she felt something she hadn't felt in 5 long years. She felt hope. The first week of work went by quietly. DeMarco showed up every afternoon at 1:15 like clockwork. Margaret found herself looking at the clock around 1 o'clock each day, listening for the sound of his truck. She told herself it was just because she wanted to make sure the work was getting done. But deep down, she knew it was more than that. Having someone around again, having life in her backyard, it felt good. DeMarco worked steadily, pulling out the old fence posts, clearing away the rotted wood. He didn't talk much while he worked, but during his breaks, he'd sit on her back porch steps and drink the iced tea she brought him. At first, their conversations were simple. The weather, how the work was going. Safe topics that didn't go too deep. But by the second week, something shifted. It was a Thursday afternoon, hot and humid, like only Atlanta and summer can be. DeMarco had been working for about 2 hours when a sudden rainstorm rolled in. Not a big storm, just one of those quick summer showers that come out of nowhere. Margaret opened her back door and called out to him. "DeMarco, come inside before you get soaked." He grabbed his tools and jogged to the porch, laughing as the rain started to pour. They stood under the covered porch for a moment, watching the rain come down in sheets. Then, Margaret surprised herself. "Would you like to come in for some lunch? I made too much chicken salad, and it'll just go to waste." DeMarco looked at her, then smiled. "I'd like that, Mrs. Henderson. Thank you." They sat at her kitchen table, the same table where she'd eaten thousands of meals with Thomas. It felt strange at first, having someone else sitting across from her. But DeMarco was easy to talk to. He complimented her chicken salad, asked about the photos on her refrigerator, and before she knew it, Margaret was telling him about her grandchildren. "That's my son Daniel's youngest," she said, pointing to a photo of a teenage girl in a soccer uniform. "She just got a scholarship to play college ball. I'm so proud of her." "You should be," DeMarco said. "That's amazing. Do you see them often?" Margaret's smile faded just a little. "Not as much as I'd like. Daniel lives in Chicago now. His job moved him there 3 years ago. They visit maybe twice a year. My daughter lives closer, over in Decatur, but she's so busy with her work. I understand, you know. People have their own lives." She said it matter-of-factly, but DeMarco heard the loneliness underneath the words. He knew that feeling. He knew it well. "I understand that too," he said quietly. "My daughter, Kaisha, she's 15. Lives with her mother most of the time since the divorce. I get her every other weekend and Wednesdays for dinner, but it's not enough. Never feels like enough." Margaret looked at him with new understanding. "How long have you been divorced?" "About 1.5 years now. It was hard, but it was the right thing. We just grew apart, wanted different things. The hardest part is missing my daughter. I call her every night, but sometimes she's busy with friends or homework. And I just sit there wondering what she's doing. Is she okay?" They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the rain still pattering against the windows. Two people who'd lived completely different lives, but who understood the same kind of loneliness. After that day, lunch became part of their routine. Margaret started preparing extra food, and DeMarco always accepted gratefully. They talked about everything. He told her about his struggles to grow his contracting business, how he was trying to save up to rent a proper office space instead of running everything from his truck. She told him about her volunteer work at the library, how she read to children every Tuesday morning, and how their faces lit up when she did the funny voices. "You should hear her do the monster voice," she said, laughing. "The kids love it. One little boy told me I was scarier than his big brother." DeMarco grinned. "I bet you're great at it. You've got that grandmother energy. Warm but doesn't take any nonsense. Is that what I've got?" Margaret asked, amused. "Absolutely. I could tell the first day I met you. You're tough when you need to be, but kind all the way through." Margaret felt her cheeks warm at the compliment. It had been so long since anyone had said something like that to her. Thomas used to say she had a steel spine wrapped in velvet, but that was years ago now. As the third week began, the fence was taking shape. New posts stood straight and strong, and DeMarco had started putting up the panels. Margaret watched from her kitchen window sometimes, impressed by how hard he worked. He never cut corners, never rushed. Everything was measured twice, checked 3 times. One afternoon, DeMarco's phone rang while they were having lunch. Margaret saw his whole face change when he looked at the screen. He answered quickly, his voice full of warmth. "Hey, baby girl. How was school?" Margaret quietly got up and moved to the sink, giving him privacy, but she couldn't help overhearing his side of the conversation. I know. I'm sorry I missed the game. My job ran late, and I tried, Kaisha. I really did. Next time, I promise. I love you too, sweetheart." When he hung up, his shoulders were slumped. Margaret turned around and saw the pain in his eyes. "She had a basketball game yesterday," he said softly. "I was supposed to be there, but I had to finish a job that ran over. Her mom sent me pictures, but it's not the same. I missed seeing her make the winning shot." Margaret walked back to the table and sat down. "Being a parent is the hardest thing in the world," she said. "And it doesn't matter if they're 5 or 50. You're always going to feel like you're not doing enough. But that girl knows you love her. I can hear it in your voice when you talk to her. That matters more than you think. I just want to give her stability, you know?" DeMarco said, "I want her to see that I've got my life together, that I can provide a good home if she wants to live with me. Right now, I'm renting a small apartment, working job to job. Her mom's got the house, a steady paycheck. How can I compete with that?" "You're not competing," Margaret said firmly. "You're just loving your daughter. That's all you can do. Love her and show up when you can. The rest will work itself out." They talked for another hour that day, longer than usual. DeMarco opened up about his marriage, about how he and his ex-wife had married young, had Keisha right away, and then slowly realized they didn't really know each other. About how hard it was to split custody, to go from seeing his daughter every day to having an empty apartment most nights. Margaret shared things too. About how she'd met Thomas at a church dance when she was 19, how they'd had almost 50 years together, but now the house felt too big and too quiet. About how some days she forgot to eat lunch because there was no one to eat with. About how she sometimes set 2 plates at dinner before remembering she was alone. By the time DeMarco left that evening, something had shifted between them. They weren't just a contractor and a customer anymore. They were friends. Real friends who'd seen each other's lonely places and hadn't turned away as Margaret cleaned up the kitchen that night. She realized she'd laughed more in the past 3 weeks than she had in the past 3 years. Her fence was almost finished, which meant soon DeMarco would be gone, off to his next job. The thought made her chest feel tight. She didn't know what that meant. She didn't let herself think about it too much. But that night, for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel quite so alone in her big, empty house. And somehow, that was enough. The fence was finished on a Friday afternoon. Margaret stood in her backyard with DeMarco, looking at the neat rows of wooden panels, the sturdy posts painted a fresh white. It was beautiful work, better than the old fence had ever been. DeMarco had even added a decorative touch at the top, a simple design that caught the sunlight. "It's perfect," Margaret said, and she meant it. But her voice sounded sad even to her own ears. DeMarco heard it too. "You don't sound happy." Margaret laughed, a little embarrassed. "No, I am. Really, it's wonderful work. I'm just going to miss having you around, that's all. The house will go back to being quiet again." He nodded slowly, looking at the fence instead of at her. "I'm going to miss being here too, Mrs. Henderson. These past 3 weeks, they've been good for me. Really good." They stood there in awkward silence for a moment. Margaret wanted to say something, wanted to ask if maybe he'd like to come by for dinner sometime, or a coffee, but she felt foolish. What would a 45-year-old man want with having dinner with an old woman? He probably had friends his own age, a whole life she knew nothing about. "Well," DeMarco said finally, "I should get my tools packed up. Let me give you a call next week about the final payment. No rush on it." "All right," Margaret said quietly. She watched him gather his things, load his truck, and drive away. The backyard felt empty without the sound of his hammer, without his presence. She went inside and sat at her kitchen table, feeling more alone than she had in weeks. That weekend was hard. Margaret tried to keep busy, but everything reminded her of the conversations she'd had with DeMarco. The kitchen table where they'd shared lunch. The back porch where he'd taken his breaks. Even the fence itself, standing there perfect and complete, felt like an ending. By Sunday evening, she'd made a decision. She would call DeMarco and ask him to dinner. As friends, nothing more. Just because the work was done didn't mean the friendship had to end. She practiced what she'd say, wrote it down on a piece of paper, then felt ridiculous and threw the paper away. But Monday morning, before she could lose her nerve, her phone rang. It was DeMarco. "Mrs. Henderson, I hope I'm not calling too early." "No, not at all." "Is everything okay?" "Yeah, everything's fine." "I was just wondering, would you like to have lunch today?" "My treat. There's a little diner downtown that makes great pie, and I thought maybe we could celebrate the finished fence." Margaret felt her heart lift. I'd love that. They met at the diner at noon. It was a small place with red vinyl booths and a jukebox in the corner that didn't work anymore. DeMarco was already there when she arrived, and he stood up when he saw her, pulling out her chair like a gentleman. They ordered sandwiches and coffee, and when the waitress brought 2 slices of peach pie without them even asking, DeMarco grinned. I called ahead, he admitted. Told them to bring the pie no matter what we ordered. They talked and laughed like they had in her kitchen, but something felt different. There was an energy between them, something Margaret couldn't quite name. She caught DeMarco looking at her a few times with an expression she couldn't read. After they finished eating, they sat there with their coffee cups, neither one ready to leave. Mrs. Henderson, DeMarco said, then stopped. Actually, would it be okay if I called you Margaret? Mrs. Henderson feels too formal now. Of course. I'd like that. Margaret, I need to tell you something. These past few weeks, getting to know you, they've meant a lot to me. More than you probably realize. You've reminded me that good people still exist in this world. That kindness matters. I haven't felt this comfortable talking to someone in years. Margaret felt her throat tighten. You've done the same for me, DeMarco. You've made me feel less alone, less invisible. When you get to be my age, sometimes people stop seeing you. But you've really seen me, listened to me. That's a gift. DeMarco reached across the table and took her hand. It was a simple gesture, but it felt monumental. His hand was warm and calloused from work. Hers was smaller, aged, with spots and wrinkles she tried not to think about. But holding his hand felt right somehow. I don't want this to end, he said quietly. The friendship, I mean. I'd like to keep seeing you, if that's okay. Maybe I could take you to dinner sometimes, or we could go to a movie, or just sit and talk like we've been doing. I'd like that very much, Margaret said. They left the diner together, and DeMarco walked her to her car. As she drove home, Margaret felt like she was floating. She had a friend. A real friend who wanted to spend time with her. It didn't matter that he was younger, or that they came from different worlds. They understood each other, and that was rare. Over the next 2 weeks, they saw each other 3 times. Once for coffee, once for a walk in the park, and once DeMarco came over for dinner and Margaret cooked pot roast, the way Thomas used to like it. DeMarco ate 2 helpings and praised her cooking until she blushed. But something was building inside Margaret, something she was afraid to name. She found herself thinking about DeMarco constantly, wondering what he was doing, if he was okay, if he was happy. She caught herself looking forward to his calls like a schoolgirl. And one night, sitting alone in her living room, she admitted the truth to herself. She had feelings for him. Real feelings. The kind that made her heart beat faster and her stomach flutter. At 70 years old, she was falling for someone, and it terrified her. For days, she wrestled with it. She told herself she was being ridiculous. He was 25 years younger than her. He probably saw her as a grandmother figure, nothing more. The idea that he could feel the same way was absurd. But the heart doesn't listen to logic, and Margaret's heart had made up its mind, thought it was a Wednesday afternoon when everything changed. DeMarco had come over to fix a loose board on her porch, something he'd noticed the last time he visited. Margaret brought him lemonade and sat with him while he worked. They were talking about his daughter, about how Kaisha wanted to try out for the varsity basketball team. And suddenly, watching him smile as he talked about his daughter, watching the way the sunlight caught his eyes, Margaret felt something break open inside her. Words came tumbling out before she could stop them. Will you marry me? The hammer slipped from DeMarco's hand and clattered onto the porch. He stared at her, his mouth open, completely frozen. Margaret's face went hot. She couldn't believe she'd said it out loud. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have. I don't know what I was thinking. Wait, DeMarco said, finding his voice. Did you just propose to me?" Margaret wanted to run inside and lock the door and never come out again. Instead, she took a deep breath. She'd already said it. She might as well explain. "I know it sounds crazy," she said, her words coming fast. "And maybe it is crazy, but hear me out. I have this big house all to myself. I have my pension and some money saved up. You're struggling to build your business, struggling with the custody situation with Kaisha. What if we could help each other?" DeMarco sat down heavily on the porch steps. "Margaret, I'm not joking," she continued, her voice shaking but determined. "I know there's an age difference. I know what people would say. But these past few weeks, I've been happier than I've been in 5 years. You make me laugh. You make me feel alive. And I think I could make you happy too. I could give Kaisha a stable home. You could have a real base for your business. We could be good for each other." She stopped, breathless, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might break through her chest. DeMarco looked at her for a long moment. His expression was unreadable. Finally, he spoke, his voice soft and careful. "You're serious. You're really serious about this?" "I'm not joking," Margaret repeated. "I know it's unconventional. I know it's fast. But when you get to my age, you realize life's too short to waste time. I care about you, DeMarco, more than I probably should. And if there's even a chance that you feel something too, then why not? Why not take a chance on something that could be good?" DeMarco stood up slowly. He walked to the edge of the porch and looked out at the street, his back to her. Margaret's heart sank. She'd ruined everything. She'd scared him away with her foolish old lady dreams. But then he turned around, and there were tears in his eyes. "I need time to think about this," he said quietly. It's a lot, Margaret. I need to think." "Of course," she whispered. "Take all the time you need." He picked up his tools and left without finishing the porch repair. Margaret watched him drive away, and then she went inside and cried. She cried for her loneliness, for her boldness, for the possibility that she'd just lost the best friend she'd had in years. But somewhere underneath the fear and embarrassment, there was something else. A tiny spark of hope. Because DeMarco hadn't said no. He'd said he needed to think. And that meant there was still a chance, however small, that her crazy proposal might not be so crazy after all.